Louis Armstrong once said he didn't know exactly where he came from, and for decades nobody did. Born in the poorest quarter of New Orleans, his origins were buried under poverty, incomplete records, and the deliberate erasure that slavery imposed on millions of Black American families. But when modern DNA analysis was applied to his ancestry, what emerged wasn't just a family tree, it was a map that rewrote everything. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. He was born on August 4th, 1901, in a neighborhood so poor and so dangerous that New Orleans residents had given it a name that said everything: the battlefield. It was a district of unpaved streets, overcrowded shotgun houses, and a level of poverty that the rest of the city preferred not to look at directly. Louis Armstrong entered the world here, the son of a teenage mother named Mary Ann Albert, known to everyone as My Ann, and a father, William Armstrong, who left the family so early that he was barely a presence in his son's memory. My Ann was 15 when Louis was born. She raised him with almost nothing, often leaving him in the care of his grandmother, Josephine Armstrong, while she worked. The family had no resources, no property, no safety net of any kind. Louis grew up cycling between his mother's care and his grandmother's house, absorbing the sounds of the neighborhood around him, the brass bands that marched through the streets, the music that drifted out of the clubs and churches and storefronts of Black New Orleans. At 11, Armstrong was arrested for firing a pistol into the air on New Year's Eve and sent to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, a reform institution on the outskirts of the city. It was there, under the instruction of a band director named Peter Davis, that he first put a cornet to his lips. What happened next is history, but what came before it, the family that produced him, the generations that preceded My Ann and William Armstrong, was a different kind of story entirely. Armstrong himself could not trace his family far. The records simply did not exist. No birth certificates, no marriage records, no documented lineage that reached back beyond the people he had personally known. He knew his grandmother. He knew fragments about his parents. Beyond that, the past closed off. For a man who would go on to become one of the most globally recognized human beings of the 20th century, the silence where his family history should have been was absolute, and it was not an accident. The silence in Armstrong's family history was not unique to him. It was the condition of millions. For descendants of enslaved people in the American South, genealogical research does not simply become difficult at a certain point. It stops. The wall is not metaphorical. It is structural, built into the legal and administrative architecture of slavery itself. Before emancipation, enslaved people were not recorded as people. They appeared in the United States Census as property listed in what were called slave schedules, columns of numbers showing age, sex, and physical description, but no names, no parents, no family connections, no origins. A man might be listed as a 35-year-old male, dark complexion, and nothing else. His children, his wife, his mother would appear on the same page as separate entries, with no indication that they had ever known each other. The system did not recognize their humanity. When emancipation came in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau worked to document the newly freed population, recording names, marriages, and labor contracts. It was an enormous undertaking, and it preserved information that would otherwise have vanished entirely. But the Bureau's records were incomplete, inconsistently maintained, and covered only a fraction of the people who needed documenting. For many families, the Bureau's records offered a starting point just after the wall, not a way through it. Louisiana added its own layer of complexity. The state had developed one of the most stratified racial societies in the entire South, a three-tiered structure of white residents, free people of color, and enslaved people. This created genealogical trails of unusual intricacy, where family lines crossed legal categories, where mixed ancestry was common and often undocumented, and where the records that did survive frequently concealed as much as they revealed. Names changed, relationships were obscured, legal status shifted across generations in ways that left paper trails full of gaps and contradictions. For Armstrong's family, as for most black families in Louisiana, standard genealogical research ran out of road around 1870. Everything before emancipation existed in a documentary silence so complete that no amount of archival work could fully penetrate it. Breaking through would require something that archives could not provide. The tools that could cross that wall arrived gradually, built not by historians, but by geneticists. And when they were finally applied to the problem of Black American ancestry, they changed what was possible in ways that no one in the archival tradition had anticipated. African Ancestry Incorporated was founded in 2003 by geneticist Rick Kittles and entrepreneur Gina Page with a specific purpose: to help descendants of enslaved Africans identify the ethnic and geographic origins that the slave trade had stripped away. The company built a proprietary database of DNA samples collected from living populations across more than 30 African countries, representing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups. That database became the key. By comparing a customer's DNA against living African populations, the company could identify not just a continent of origin, but a specific people, a specific place. The methodology drew on three distinct types of genetic evidence. Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son unchanged across generations, could trace a direct paternal line back through time. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child without recombination, could trace a direct maternal line with equal precision. Together, these two markers could reach back centuries along the two most direct ancestral threads a person carries. Autosomal DNA, which captures the full genetic mixture inherited from all ancestral lines, provided a broader picture of ethnic composition, the overall proportions of African, European, and other ancestry blended across generations. Each type of evidence answered a different question. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial markers could name specific ethnic origins with high confidence. The autosomal results could map the proportions of a more complex ancestry, but could not always resolve which specific line and particular genetic contribution came from. Together, they offered a layered portrait that was precise in some directions and probabilistic in others. For Armstrong's ancestry, the question was whether those signals had survived intact. Centuries of displacement, the genetic disruptions caused by slavery's forced migrations, and the mixing of populations across generations could all degrade or complicate the signal. The methodology was powerful, but the results would depend entirely on what the DNA had preserved and on what history had irreversibly scrambled. When the results came back, they carried a specificity that no document in any archive had ever been able to provide. Armstrong's maternal line, the direct thread running from mother to mother back through generations, pointed to West and Central Africa with a clarity that surprised even researchers familiar with the technology. The signal had survived. Forced migration and the genetic disruptions of slavery had not erased what his ancestors carried. The maternal line traced back to populations in Cameroon and the Congo Basin, a region that had supplied a significant portion of the enslaved people brought to Louisiana during the transatlantic slave trade. This was not a coincidence of geography. Louisiana's slave trade had specific demographic patterns. The port of New Orleans received enslaved people primarily from West and Central Africa, with particularly high concentrations from the Congo-Angola region and from the Bight of Benin. Armstrong's DNA placed his maternal ancestry precisely within those patterns, connecting him to a specific genetic community that had been present in Louisiana's enslaved population since the 18th century. The paternal line told a complementary story. The Y chromosome results pointed toward West Africa, consistent with the broader demographic profile of Louisiana's enslaved population, but distinct in their specific ethnic markers. Two separate ancestral threads running back through different lines of his family. Both arrived at the African continent, and both pointed to communities that history had transported to Louisiana against their will. What the results established was not just a geographic origin, it was an ethnic identity. Armstrong's ancestors were not simply African in the broad, flattened sense that slavery had imposed on millions of people by stripping them of their specific identities. They belonged to specific peoples, specific cultures, specific traditions that had existed long before the slave trade and continued to exist after it. The DNA had recovered something that the archive had buried, not completely, not with every detail intact, but enough to replace silence with a name. That recovery was significant, but it was only part of what the analysis revealed, because alongside the African signal, the DNA contained something else entirely. The European genetic signal in Armstrong's DNA was not surprising in the way that a genuine anomaly is surprising. It was surprising in the way that a confirmation of something long suspected but never proven tends to land, with weight rather than shock. For descendants of enslaved people in the American South, European ancestry is statistically common. The mechanisms that produced it were not. Across the slave-holding South, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men was systematic, widespread, and almost entirely undocumented in any way that named the individuals involved. It did not appear in census records. It did not appear in church documents. It appeared, if at all, in the DNA of descendants who had no way of knowing whose name belonged to the genetic signal they carried. The European thread running through Black American families is, in the majority of cases, not the product of equal relationships or willing unions. It is the product of a power structure that gave enslaved women no legal standing, no recourse, and no voice. Louisiana's particular social architecture made this history even more complex. The state's pillagage system, an extra-legal arrangement in which white men entered into long-term relationships with free women of color, providing financial support in exchange for companionship, created a documented mixed-race community in New Orleans that was unlike anything elsewhere in the South. But plaguage involved free women of color, not enslaved women. For the enslaved population, the European genetic contributions in their descendants' DNA came through a different and darker channel entirely. In Armstrong's case, the European component appeared in his autosomal results, present across his broader ancestry rather than concentrated in a single direct line. This suggested that the European contribution had entered his family tree not through one identifiable moment, but through multiple generations of mixing, some of it voluntary, much of it not. The DNA could detect the presence of that ancestry. It could estimate its proportion. It could not recover the identities of the individuals involved, nor the circumstances under which those genetic contributions were made. The signal was there. The story behind it had been erased. That erasure was not accidental, it was the point. The question of indigenous ancestry in Armstrong's DNA opened a different kind of historical conversation, one that Louisiana's own geography made impossible to dismiss. Louisiana was not simply a black and white society, it never had been. Before European colonization, the land that would become Louisiana was home to dozens of distinct Native American nations: the Choctaw, the Houma, the Natchez, the Tunica, and others, whose presence shaped the region's culture, trade networks, and social patterns long before the first enslaved Africans arrived. When those worlds collided and merged across centuries of proximity, the genetic evidence of those encounters did not disappear. It was carried forward, embedded in the DNA of people who had no documents to explain where it came from. For Black communities in Louisiana specifically, contact with Native American populations was not marginal. It was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that formal records almost never captured. Escaped enslaved people sought refuge in Native American communities. Freed Black families settled in areas adjacent to indigenous settlements. In the bayous and marshlands south of New Orleans, communities developed that blended African, Native American, and sometimes European ancestry in proportions that defied the legal racial categories the state attempted to impose. The Houma Nation, in particular, had a documented history of absorbing members of other communities, including people of African descent. Whether Armstrong's DNA carried a detectable indigenous signal remains one of the more contested aspects of his ancestral analysis. The autosomal results that might reveal Native American ancestry are the most susceptible to the complexities of generational mixing. A Native American ancestor several generations back can leave a genetic contribution too small to distinguish reliably from certain African or European genetic populations that share overlapping markers. The precision that Y chromosome and mitochondrial testing provided for his African lines was harder to replicate for a potential indigenous thread. What the analysis could confirm was the broader truth that the indigenous question represented. Armstrong's ancestry did not fit neatly into any single category. His DNA reflected the actual history of Louisiana, layered, complex, and resistant to the simplified racial narratives that American society had long preferred. The full picture was more intricate than any single answer could contain, and one dimension of that picture remained the most historically loaded of all. Armstrong rarely spoke about ancestry in terms of bloodlines or ethnic origins. That vocabulary was not available to him in the way it is now, and the records that might have given him a traceable past had never existed in a form he could access. What he spoke about instead was New Orleans, the city as a living inheritance, the streets and sounds and community structures that had shaped him more completely than any document could have recorded. He described the music of his neighborhood as something that entered him before he understood what it was. The brass bands, the church choirs, the blues drifting from the clubs on Perdido Street, these were his education in a place where formal education was barely accessible to him. When he later said that he was born poor and had stayed honest, he was not offering false modesty. He was describing a relationship with his origins that was grounded entirely in what he had lived rather than what he could prove. What the DNA now placed behind those words was a specific geography of origin. The West and Central African communities that his maternal and paternal lines traced back to were not silent or passive recipients of history. The Congo Basin cultures that appear in his maternal line had sophisticated musical traditions, polyrhythmic drumming, communal song structures, and call and response patterns that scholars of African diaspora music have long identified as foundational influences on the jazz that emerged in New Orleans. Armstrong did not know this connection by name. He lived it by inheritance. The European thread in his ancestry represented the other side of that inheritance, the violence and exploitation that had moved his ancestors across an ocean and stripped them of the names that would have made them traceable. The DNA confirmed what the history of Louisiana's enslaved population already made statistically certain. Armstrong carried that history in his cells without ever having been able to read it in a document. He built his identity on what survived the erasure. The DNA revealed that what survived was more specific, more rooted, and more connected to particular human traditions than even he could have known. Louis Armstrong came from a world that had been stripped of its records, its names, and its traceable past. What the DNA revealed was not simply his ancestry, it was the outline of a history that slavery had worked to make invisible. His genetic signature crossed continents and centuries, connecting him to specific peoples and places that exist in no archive. The names of the individuals who carried that DNA before him are gone, but the signal they left behind was strong enough to cross every wall that history had built against it.